Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 to 21. Did I put that whole text in your notes? Let me read. The topic is 3 traits of character you can't live without. Daniel 1, 8. We read some of these verses last week, and now we're continuing a little further. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. And therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head to the king. Let me just explain that. Daniel goes to this chief and says, I'm not going to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine. I just want you to know that. And this guy says to Daniel, great, so the king is going to inspect all of you guys, and when you look thin and weak compared to the others, the king's going to want my head. Why are you doing this to me? Okay, that's where it's at. 11. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by the way. Verse 12, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance, fatter in flesh, than all the youths who ate the king's food. And so the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for the 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And you know how that's going to play into the story later on. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters who were in his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. We'll see later on why that is a very significant fact, that Daniel's there until King Cyrus of the Medes and the Persians, whom God will use to deliver the Jews from Babylonian captivity. Lord, just help us tonight as we look into your word. Thanks for the privilege. It's summer, and a lot of us have had a full day. May we come with minds that are alert and quickened by your Holy Spirit. The things that you would want to speak into our hearts, we want to hear, we want to obey. In Jesus' name, amen. We looked at Daniel the last 2 Sunday nights and studied how verse 8 of chapter 1 says he purposed in his heart not to defile himself. He purposed in his heart. You can't live well accidentally. You have to intend something. You have to aim at something. Plant the flag somewhere. You have to intend with all your might to please the Lord. Great strength, great talent, great ability, great energy is all wasted unless it's aimed at something great as well. I don't know if you've read any of the great biographies of the theologian Jonathan Edwards. I love reading about Jonathan Edwards. Most people only know Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and get a really wrong caricature of what Jonathan Edwards must have been like. When he was still a teenager, I have the book. He wrote down solely for his own use. It has been published, but he never intended it for publication. A set of resolutions that he lived by. He wrote 70 of them before the age of 20. In other words, all of these resolutions were written while he was a teenager. Let me read a couple of them to you. Now, the English is a little different than we're used to hearing, but you can catch on to what's being said. Quote, resolved. They all start with that word. Resolved. Never to do any manner of thing, whether in soul or body, less or more, but what tends to the glory of God. Resolved. That I will live just so as I can think I shall wish I had done, supposing I live to old age. That's a great resolution. Resolved, never to give over, nor in the least to slacken my fight with my own corruptions, however unsuccessful I might be. That's a great resolution because he recognizes he's not always going to win, but he's never going to stop fighting. I like that. 4, I'm not reading very many, by the way. Resolved, never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if I expected it would not be above an hour before I should hear the last trump. Never do anything that I wouldn't do if I thought Jesus was coming back at 10 after 7 tonight. Now, they're interesting. There's 70 of them. They have been published. If you ever want to go online and get a copy, you can get them in a little paperback for about $7. You can get his resolutions. But the big strong word at the beginning of those great statements isn't intended, or sure hope, or if I can swing it. There's something about that word resolved. You say it like cement. You put your whole being into a word like that. I mean, just imagine getting up very early in the morning and before you do anything else, taking the time to prayerfully read over 70 resolutions for living those next 24 hours. That's what Jonathan Edwards did. Every morning, read over all the resolutions for the next 24 hours. Lots of Christians wish they were more spiritual. Lots of Christians imagine what they might do for Jesus one day if their circumstances changed for the better. If they had someone else's opportunities or someone else's talent. That's not what Daniel did. Starting now, he's 15. He's 15 years old when he's taken into captivity in Babylon. Starting now, 15 years of age, starting alone, separated from his land, the temple, all of his heritage, starting in Babylon, in a hostile environment that was trying to suck the spiritual life out of his heart, right there, right then, Daniel purposed in his heart. Now, starting now. Either you live like that for the Lord or you don't. If you're going to do it, you'll do it right away. If you don't, then you probably never will. If you don't make up your mind right now, you probably won't. So if you don't take the first chance to plant the flag, it's not likely you're going to take the second chance farther down the road. And so Daniel doesn't whine, he doesn't complain. Why was he taken? Other people weren't. He just bites the bullet, draws a line in the sand, he does it right away, and he says, I'm purposing in my heart how I'm going to respond and how I'm going to live. As you study Daniel, and this is what we're going to look at tonight, you'll see 3 traits of character that form the foundation of his commitment to the Lord. These aren't his decisions, these are the motives behind his decisions. You have to think right before you can live right. And if you were to take Daniel, and if you could possibly do some kind of spiritual CAT scan, here's what you would see inside Daniel. Trait number 1. If you're serious about following the Lord, you must be braced for opposition from the world. I know that's obvious, but remember, Daniel's 15 years old, and he's not with his friends at youth group at the temple. We don't know exactly how much close contact he had with others while in captivity, but it's pretty well certain that he did have large blocks of time where he was totally on his own. What did he think about? I wonder when he sat down if he sort of asked himself, at what point will you start to say no to Babylon? Because he knew their purposes and their intent. If you've been here the last 2 Sunday nights, we've covered all of that. I wonder if he thought to himself, for sure, unless you're going to constantly say how high when they jump, you're going to have to say no at some point, and there's going to be pushback. There'll be consequences to that. He's not in charge when he's in Babylon. At what point? At what point will he say no to the king of Babylon? I think we all have to think about that issue. I kick myself sometimes when I don't think about this enough. Think about when you're watching what's trending on TV or on Netflix. Where will you start drawing your moral boundaries? You know, if not after 20 or 30 F-bombs, how many does it take before you start to get a little offended? 10? 5? Do you know? How many illicit sex scenes before you say, enough? 30? 20? 5? At what point? At what point do you listen to your Lord who says, pluck out your eye if it leads you into sinful stuff? How gross does something have to become? Or have you ever addressed it? Have you ever sat down, this is Daniel purposing in his heart, have you ever sat down and thought about, where are your uncrossable lines? Do you have any? Daniel does the smart thing. Daniel knows his holiness boundaries. He knows where he won't compromise, and he starts right there, right off the bat. Now, here's how the argument will come back to that kind of thinking. Pastor Don, it seems like such a little issue. Here's Daniel, not going to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine. Why make such a fuss over some food or drink? Contemporize it. Pastor Don, all the TV shows are like that. That's just the way it is. Get over it. This is what all my friends do, Pastor Don. I hear that all the time. I'm going to go into that food issue in depth in just a few minutes. But right now, let me just say, you're absolutely right. Most of these things don't seem like huge issues in our eyes. They don't seem, look at Daniel's case, they don't seem worth the kind of moral muscle that Daniel exercises. But let's proceed with this argument a little bit. Stay with me. You have to start somewhere if you're going to deal with spiritual compromise. You have to start somewhere. And if you're prepared to surrender that first point of compromise just because it seems small, then what about the next compromise, which I can tell you now won't seem much bigger, especially to your already clouded judgment? Did you see what I'm saying? None of them are going to seem very big to you, especially taken by themselves. And you know the stupid argument that comes back, and there's no good answer to it. Well, Pastor Don, really? Are you saying, you're going to go to hell just for that one thing? And of course, none of us wants to say, yeah, you go to hell just for that one thing. But that question's just a dodge. The issue of the way compromise happens is it always starts with something small. Otherwise, you wouldn't make the compromise, and the spirit of this age knows that. Once you start backing up morally, there is no good stopping place. Look at Daniel. Next will come the issue. You know the story. So he doesn't want to eat the king's food or drink the king's wine, and that's where Daniel draws his line. Why there? Well, because the next thing that's coming along is the issue of bowing to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Are you going to do that, Daniel? And then will come the forbidding of prayer to his God. Are you going to go along with that? So at what point, Daniel, at what point do you start saying no to Babylon? What point? And the idea here that Daniel recognizes is Daniel's refusal to bend at this first point puts him in a position of strength for the bigger points that are coming down the road. Whereas if he caves in here, he's sure going to cave in the next point. I think anyone that's serious about holiness, and I assume we're here and we're in this room because we are, has to stop and think through, seriously, deeply, prayerfully, think through the way compromise sets itself in the soul, because it is always gradual in its approach. Do you know how compromise gains its first victory in our hearts? Compromise gains its first victory in our hearts by looking too ridiculous to give very serious attention to it. You understand that? That's how it works. Compromise sets itself in the soul in its first steps by things that your friends, even in the church, are just going to think you're a little bit legalistic. Sure. Welcome to the 60s. People don't live like that anymore, Pastor Don. Compromise never begins with large aspects of rebellion. Sin always grows from less to more. And the logic of Daniel's mind is this: if you don't say no at the beginning of the process, you will never have the strength to say no further down the road. Smart. Just smart. It's the initial choices of holiness resolved. Daniel purposed in his heart. It's the initial choices of holiness that give strength for future choices of holiness. You don't start at the deep end of the pool. You start at the shallow end of the pool. I'm not even eating that stuff. So, choose to follow the Lord instantly, and then brace yourself for opposition. Opposition even from the community of faith, lots of times. Ridicule. Because faith and commitment will always be tested. And here's the nature of the test. You always measure a commitment by what it takes to bump it. If I always choose A until B comes along, then B is my real commitment, not A. Compromise has to do with the limits you have to your commitment to Christ. Whatever alters those convictions is what truly rules your life. It's the pressure of alternative options that reveals your love for Christ. It's the pressure of alternative options that reveals your love for Christ. People have high moral standards. They have high moral standards, and then they're deeply in love with someone who is scripturally off limits to them. And it's when they have the power to choose something other than what's right, that's when you see what their convictions really are. People are devoted to scriptural integrity until there's a foolproof way to make lots of money with only slight dishonesty. And it's when they have the power to choose something other than what's right and get away with it that you see what their convictions really are. People generally believe that a Christian should let his or her light shine, that it's important to tell the world about Jesus. And then they're in a different crowd, and everyone's having fun and acting in a way that is anything but Christ-like. And it's when you have the power to choose whether you will go against the grain of the moment by following Christ, or whether you'll just compromise and shave little bits off of your own character and just go with the flow. That's where you reveal who you are in Christ and what your convictions are. You simply have to win those little battles. All of us. You have to hammer out the power of your commitment right then, right there, or you're going nowhere in the kingdom of God. I think that's why Jesus said it would cost everything to follow him. I was looking at Matthew 14, 27 to 33. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, "This man began to build, but he wasn't able to finish." Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, and now Jesus tips his hand. He's not talking about building, and he's not talking about armies. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. What Jesus means is, every day I follow Jesus and every day you follow Jesus. He's saying there is something like that building project or like that king. There is something marching against you. It's coming. Are you following Jesus in such a way that 24/7 every morning you recognize there's going to be a new struggle today? There's going to be a new project today. There's going to be opposition today. And Jesus says, don't start Monday morning without thinking this through. That's what's coming at you Monday. Something bigger than you are. And the whole point of Jesus' words is you have to plan ahead, plan on that, and overcome that every time you determine to follow him. A half-baked resolve, it's not going to work. All right. So if you're going to be a Christian in this world, you recognize opposition and you resolve, you plan for it. Know the process of compromise. Know how it works. First steps of compromise always gain victory by looking ridiculously small so that you don't have to even think about them. You don't see the battle coming. Point number 2. If you're going to live as a Christian in this world, the highest motivating force in your actions, public and private, must be the glory of God. So if you wanted to just nail down the secret of Daniel's success briefly, you'd have to say he fears compromise more than he fears persecution and suffering. The only reason you'd risk a night in a lion's den rather than miss your devotions is you'd rather lose your life than dishonor God. You know, we read it this morning. Thy loving kindness is better than life. Like we all read in church this morning without really thinking the words through to their logical conclusion. It's better than life. How do you know, Pastor Don? How do you know that Daniel's motive was the glory of God? How do you know he wasn't just sort of spiritually grandstanding to earn a good reputation for himself in Babylon? I'll tell you how you know Daniel's ultimate concern was the glory of God. He shuns defilement even when no one else is looking. When we read those verses, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, Daniel takes this request, this idea of not eating this food, he takes it to two different people. Neither the king nor the commander knew anything about Daniel's convictions and resolutions. Daniel didn't tell the king about it. The king found out at the end. Daniel wasn't doing it to please the king. It's who you are in secret. That's your identity. That's your identity. Who you are when Christians are watching really means very little. Who you are when you're the only one with your neck on the world's chopping block, that determines everything. That's the person who counts with God. Remember Jonathan Edwards' teenage resolution, resolved never to do anything, whether in soul or body, less or more, but what tends to the glory of God. Here's the point that relates to living for God's glory alone. If you are a Christian and are righteous when everyone is watching, well, your motive might be to please the Lord, but your motive might be your own reputation. If you are a Christian and you are righteous in the eyes of the world and nobody of faith knows about it, then your only motive is the glory of God and honoring His name. In other words, you may talk and sing about glorifying God, but the only way to prove it is to honor Him when nobody else knows. I hurried over that. Point number 3. Strength of character comes from remembering who you are and relying on the promise of God's Word. Relying on the promise of God's Word. That's the first thing I want to talk about. This is something Daniel knows. He knows the Word, and he knows God's promise, and he knows there's a deliverance coming down the road. God did more than bring His people into Babylonian captivity. In His great love and mercy, God did two things. Babylon came, the Chaldeans. They came and took Jerusalem, took this representative group, took them back to Babylon, sacked Jerusalem and the temple and the city. It was God's judgment for the people's worldliness under Jehoiakim. But God did two other things. First, He warned them in His wisdom that judgment was coming. He warned them in advance. This was so the people would not only feel the pain of captivity, but they would have the opportunity to learn lessons from it. So, without these advance warnings, God saying, I'm bringing the Chaldeans. That's what the book of Habakkuk is all about. Habakkuk is a prophet who has to tell his people, the Chaldeans are coming. And it's because of our wickedness. That's his job. And nobody likes it. But without those advance warnings, the people might miss out on any corrective benefit and simply attribute their suffering to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And then they would not only suffer, but they would suffer for nothing. The lesson is stay in the Word during trials. Look to see what God might be developing in your heart. The second thing God did, he warned them in advance that this Babylonian captivity was his judgment. There was a purpose to it. And the second thing he did was promise them his protection and ultimately their deliverance once the Babylonian captivity had served its purpose. That was to keep the people from despair. The first, warning them in advance, that was so they could learn from it. The second, promising them deliverance, was so they could go through it without despair. And so, years before Nebuchadnezzar even came on the scene, this is fascinating. Years before Nebuchadnezzar comes on the scene, God gave advance promise of his protection and care during the Babylonian captivity. And you get some of these words. Isaiah 43, 1 and 2. But now thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. The flame shall not consume you. Those are certainly beautiful verses of Scripture. I've heard worship courses that we've sung from the Old Testament. But actually, those words were specifically spoken by the prophet Isaiah, and they're in reference to the future captivity of God's people under the power of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Though you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched. And however preciously poetic we think those words are, imagine what they would mean to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Though you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned. Remember this lesson all your life when facing the fire of this world, when you're tempted to lose heart, when friends pressure you into conforming to their standards for your life. Whatever you do, don't face those situations armed with nothing but your own willpower. Call to life the power of the Word. This is why you hide it in your heart. This is why it's important to read it, study it, memorize it, even when you don't think there's any immediate benefit coming to you that morning when you read the text. Have you ever done that? You're reading in 2 Chronicles. You go through 2 chapters, you stop and you think, good night, nurse. What did I get out of this? And I'll tell you the answer to that. What you got out of it was more than you feel right at that minute. Store up God's Word in your heart. So first, rely on the promise of God's Word. Secondly, remember who you are in Christ. Now, I said I wanted to wrap up, and this is the last, talking about the whole food thing. I can't think of an issue where there is more confusion in the body of Christ than all of the food regulations in the Old Testament. It's like the church we really don't know what to do with that stuff. And so I'm going to try really quickly to tell you what you should do with it. Remember who you are in Christ. We know from the teaching of Jesus that eating food or not eating food isn't what makes a person clean or unclean. We are positive about that because Jesus said so. That's in Mark 7, 14 through 16. So here's a bedrock principle that you start with. And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him." That's eating. Nothing. But the things that come out of a person, out of the mouth, the thoughts, the attitudes, those are what defile him. So that's pretty straightforward. Food doesn't contaminate the heart. That's what Jesus is saying. Paul said that God has given us all things richly to enjoy. Peter's heavenly vision, the Lord tells Peter not to separate foods into categories of clean and unclean. Okay, we're done with that. There's religions all over the world that still do it, and the teaching of the New Testament is, if you want to go on a particular diet, that's up to you. There is nothing spiritual in it. That's the teaching of the New Testament. Okay, so what's Daniel doing? And why does God seem to honor it? Well, Daniel was raised to remember a very important event in the life of Israel. Next to the fact of their calling in Abraham, the next fact that they all remembered was called in Abraham and they were delivered from Egypt. They were never to forget those two things. They were to remember that they were brought out of Egypt into their own land, and that would have particular impact for Daniel as he sits 15 years old in Babylon. Now, there were a lot of other related truths that went along with that deliverance from Egypt. Israel's God was separate from the gods of the nations. He told them that over and over again. Their deliverance firmly established in their minds their separate identity from all the nations and all the gods of the nations around them. So, after they were delivered from Egypt, God got his people together and he gave them regulations about food. Stuff like this, let me read it quick. Leviticus 11:45-47. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Okay, there's the context. I'm the God who delivered you from Egypt. Thus, or therefore, you shall be holy, for I am holy. God keeps speaking. This is the law regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. Now, notice, all of those regulations about diet, they were all tied in with their deliverance from Egypt. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. You should be holy, for I am holy. And then regulations about food. You all with me still so far? Okay, good. So these dietary laws were to be visible reminders of their identity. Separate, delivered people by the one true God. These were not health regulations. God wasn't recommending a diet. I saw a book in a Christian bookstore, the Daniel diet. If you want to do that, fine. But that's not why God did this, not by a mile. When they were tempted to despair, when their enemies looked too strong to overcome, when they doubted God's presence, well, they still had to eat. And so, built right into their eating habits was the God-given reminder of his great, merciful, faithful, delivering power. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt, therefore eat like this. So God in his grace gave them visible outward marks of his possession so that they would have something to live up to. He was to be for them what he was to be for them inwardly, he gave them a sign of outwardly. Now here's what happened. Later on in their history, the people turned these laws into something they were never designed to be. They were never given as a code of works by which people could earn their standing with God. That was the work of the scribes and the Pharisees. And Jesus was constantly banging heads with them. Also, these signs were never given to be replacements for a living inward relationship with God. This is what David was referring to in Psalm 51 when he said, "You do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering." What? God commanded those things. What do you mean he's not pleased with them? The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart. So these dietary regulations were given as reminders that they were a delivered people, and they didn't even eat like the nations around them because their God was separate from the religions and the nations around them. That's why those regulations were given. And they turned them into ways of earning merit points with God. And they turned it into a form of just outward worship where whether they were loving and serving the Lord in their heart or not didn't matter. I kept the list. And so they distorted what God had given them. These dietary regulations were never given to earn deliverance. The regulations were given after the deliverance to remind them of the fact that they were a freed people by God's grace. The regulations weren't given to replace a living relationship with God. They were empty and pointless when removed from the context of a thankful remembering of their delivering God, which is why, now that Jesus has come, the deliverance you and I have experienced is greater than anyone ever experienced from Egypt. We've been delivered from the enemy of our souls and our iniquities and the wrath of God and the fear of death. Don't you dare go back under those regulations anymore, Paul says. What they point to has all been replaced. That's why the writer of Hebrews, the actual word he uses in Hebrews is, these things are obsolete. Most of the world doesn't know that, but you need to know it. Okay. Here's the question. So why does Daniel care so much about keeping these regulations? Why does he start here with drawing his line in the sand? In a nutshell, Daniel cares so much about these dietary regulations because he's in the middle of a foreign land. He is surrounded by foreign gods, foreign religions, foreign customs, foreign temptations to compromise, and the seduction of power and affluence. And in these ancient dietary laws, here's what Daniel sees. He sees a handle to his past, the God that brought him out of Egypt. It's not the food, it's the God. Everybody get it? That's what Daniel holds on to. These ancient dietary laws were the first chance Daniel had to plant the flag, the first chance he had to come out of the closet, and he declares himself as a follower of Yahweh. Brace yourself for opposition. Know how compromise works. Make the highest motive in your life the glory of God. That will be revealed by how you live when no one else is looking. And remember who you are and rely on the promises of God's Word. And everyone said?